Monday. Now, Monday is one of those days you have to study because even in a 1 point chop, you see me make 3 trades that are 100% each. That's important right at the start of the day. We're talking about the magenta algorithm. You have to understand this first trade here. Once again, dual algorithms, right? And we had very clear stops here with the 5-day moving average. So this was quite a straightforward trade. Understanding the liquidity that's being formed by magenta. So identifying this magenta early was quite crucial. What I really want to talk about is the second trade that I took here. Now this was a debit spread that I took. I bought it at 50 cents, I think, and closed it at $1 right here. Now this is important. You need to understand this because this is applicable again on Tuesday, and you will know why. Now, if I took my runners here, this was my first 100% trade, and I wanted to take some runners down. I don't want to weather the chop. And you see, it's about chaining your plays. In this case, I took my profits here, and I took half the contracts, and I opened the spread, closed it, protected it completely. I closed half. So my other half, my balance half, will be completely free for the way down. Now, I didn't close it near to this. I just didn't pay attention thereafter, half hoping it was a trend day. Sometimes it's like that. You just lose focus, but you want to have a trade that's live and running. So this is one way you can do it. Have some early profits, convert it into a spread, protect the spread if possible, and you have the remaining runners that are free for the rest of the day. This prevents you from over trading, and obviously it keeps you in the game without having to focus too much on the charts. Now, you also see how even though I had that opened, that is an afterthought. That puts became an afterthought. Because when my alerts went, I still managed to take this trade, isn't it? This break here on the way, I think it was here, right? Closed the cup, right? I mentioned the handle is forming. Teal broke out of there. And this trade was very important because I want you to see this part here, this particular section here, where the magenta is, where the break of that orange and the break of that yellow. Note the volume as well. Now, let me zoom it in from here. Now, firstly, you know that the cup has already closed here, and the market was building liquidity. And especially here, isn't it? You see the liquidity has started building that later. But you see from teal, it started building liquidity out into the pink. Now, this was important because we broke out of that teal in that magenta originally. And then we became stronger in that orange. And this was important because we have been in control by the yellow for quite some time, this range here. So when we break out of yellow, you need it out in a stronger algorithm. Now, originally it was controlled by the magenta. You saw magenta in control of breaking out of the teal. And out of nowhere, orange started pushing out with stronger volume. You see volume starting to increase from here. Now, stronger volume in orange. And you see how we broke out of that yellow in a stronger algorithm that was stronger than the magenta. So this was a good trade here. You had a good precision algorithm that you could base your supports on the breakout of not just the magenta and orange, but also breakout of this pink. So you see there are several confirmations you could take from here, and I took my calls here, closed them 100%. Absolutely beautiful trade as well. So you understand how to be chaining your plays here, and I will talk a little bit more about that later and the rest of the week. I want to explain some of the morning trades here. Now, at the start of the day here, right, we identified the magenta algorithm quite quickly. I think within this particular candle here, I've already identified the magenta. Now, this is quite an advanced technique. There is a certain chain of plays involved. So I took a call here, right? I got my 100% trade at the top of magenta here, understanding that magenta is in control. Now, very simply, we started selling aggressively. Now, you will see that sometimes the selling becomes aggressive, and I've already identified orange rhythm, and I saw that magenta was starting to form. We broke out of that selling, very strong selling, and so I'm obviously expecting a bounce, because this has to build liquidity before it starts heading down, especially if it's not in the strongest selling algorithm. This just tells you the bears are stepping back a bit and calling some breaks here and allowing the price to head up before they start selling again. And this is exactly what you see here. So this is an advanced zombie trade, because you understood the precision algorithm that broke, you understood the dual algorithms that started to form, and obviously this was a support. So if I took a trade here, it broke below magenta, I get out quickly. Quite a straightforward trade here. This was a 100% trade that I managed to take a zombie here. Right there, after we identified the magenta, you see magenta starting to build liquidity, right? No reason to trade here. Absolutely not. If you wanted to trade the teal, maybe. But at that point in time, I've already identified the pink algorithm. So maybe a particular trade here. Once we broke out, you saw green, you can take a trade here if you want to. Get to 5-day moving averages is where you protect. So absolutely, you could have taken a trade right here, but the better trade was this. And I was telling you that at this point, there's no need to chase the long, especially once it started going down in the teal. I mentioned about the zombie trade. Once again, zombie trades, right? You saw 5-day, there are so many clear resistances here if you wanted to take a zombie trade down. You saw the pink building liquidity. So you have the 5-day, you can base your stop loss on, your pink or your teal. In this case, the teal worked well, because if you took a zombie here, you could have protected it. This will be completely stress-free, because your secondary stops can be using the yellow algorithm right there. I'm sorry, I meant the 5-day moving average. It just stops, and you see how this turned out well, because you were preparing the zombie for another trade here. And just take a look. I mentioned this as well, the break of that magenta and pink. Exactly as it forms, you also see how the volume picked up here. You see how it started increasing, and then we started selling down, only because we broke the supports of that pink and triggered more stops. And you see how this trended down. It was a beautiful zombie trade because it trended down, right? You could manage your stops, you could protect your runners, and you could just manage it accordingly. And there was another structure here, if you see it, at the magenta once we started forming a nested structure. Beautiful entry here, especially of that magenta algorithm. This is a breakout and retrace. So if you wanted to add runners, if you wanted to enter, this could be a possible trade here. I mentioned one particular shortcoming of this trade was I couldn't manage to chart a beautiful precision algorithm, and you see how important it is to identify the algorithms more accurately, because without the precision it's very difficult to manage your runners here. I see this happening again, right? So manage your runners using the precision algorithms. Green is absolutely better because it has appeared twice here at the day. So hopefully the green brings this down. If you have runners, this will be great, right? You see how market's just building liquidity on the way down here. So explanation of my 200% trades in the morning. I want to talk to you a little bit about my strike price here. Now, when I bought this contract, it was at 185, I think. I don't really remember the delta. I think it was at 0.2 to 0.3. It's just a wild guess. But it's quite out of the money because it's quite low value, 185. Usually around the start of the day, something that's at the money is about $6 to $8 for SPX. So 185 thereabouts. It's quite far away. Now there's a reason why. And you noticed I closed here at what, $13? That's huge, isn't it? And you have to understand there are certain aspects to this. The first is obviously assuming that this is high of day, and we are still quite early in the day, so you can afford to go a little bit out of the money. Now, the thing about options is this: if it's a little bit out of the money, you get very large returns once it gets into the money. So once it got into the money about 642, if I'm not wrong, this was a 6430p. That's about it. It's about here. This is where SPX is at 6430, equivalent to where SPY is at 641.50. So once it got into the money, it started compounding. You get very good returns from there. And you have to understand, high of day, that's one condition. Early in the day, so I can allow it to build some structure from there. And more importantly, as a strong continuation structure. So the market was kind for me to hold this because you can see there is strong continuation. And partially because we broke out of that bullish algorithm with the strong volume as I was talking about just before this. And if we take a look at a 30-minute chart, this is obviously something we planned for, that 30-minute move with that blue algorithm right there, right? And we're selling in a very strong green, as I was mentioning. Look out for stronger selling. Now you see we're approaching this green now, so just be careful, right? So you see this stronger selling green. And yes, this is one reason why I took a strike there that's a little bit lower in delta, and to see how it had paid rewards. Now, the trading options, you need to learn how to manage your strikes. You need to learn how to maximize your risk and rewards ratio by understanding how to choose your strikes more wisely. I will talk to you more about this, but using my trades practically, you are able to study and learn more about that in real time. Yesterday, I talked about chaining your plays, how you could to take some profits from the start and convert them into a spread. And that's exactly what I did here as well, right? We had several 100% trades, I think one here, and thereafter I converted my put runners into a spread in order to weather the chop here and manage to get another 100% trade from here. You have to understand that, isn't it? And it's quite a straightforward day because of, well, literally the selling that's commencing right now with very clear orange and magenta. It's just institutional selling here, and you see it beautifully in that precision algorithm. Teal, not ideal, right? You would very much prefer right, apologies about that. You very much prefer that blue, and you see the blue did happen here on that initial break of that very tight magenta microstructure here, and you see it happening again now. Now use a teal to guide you on the way down, right? With plenty of room, but more importantly, you have to use the blue. You have to see the blue. This is your money maker, especially for trading 0 day to expiry. So always remember that. Now, very easy technique here about converting them to spreads. So please learn them this week if you can. Very important lesson for this week. About the action here. Now, early in the day, we identified the magenta. Now, there was this trade that I missed here, but this could be a very important trade if you saw the engulfing candles. This is a great trade once we started engulfing, and this was also when we identified the magenta, and we wanted to wait for the trade here, isn't it? Now, I talked about this magenta, that I would take the trade here, but I was late to the party, but you noticed that there is a certain retracement. You still could catch a trade here if you have clear stops. And in this case, if you saw the magenta building that liquidity there with a strong precision algorithm, you could still manage your stops quite tightly and manage this trade if you wanted to. Now, don't forget to be referring to this with the analysis of the day, as I was mentioning earlier about this. Let's see. this one, 946, I mentioned I would have taken the magenta. 946 was here. Right, so I could have waited for the retracement, but I wasn't ready for the trade, even though this was quite straightforward. But so early candles, you notice that sometimes the structure doesn't have to be a deep or a larger one, and that's only because we have very strong volume in the start of the day. So this was quite clear once you saw the engulfing, right? You could take it as a zombie if you remember what I mentioned, because if you wanted to wait for this could still be a zombie trade as long as it stayed within the blue. Now, if you wanted to call for the reversal, and I mentioned this, do not call it when it's still in the position. You are just facilitating the selling by becoming exit liquidity. So you have to understand this very clearly. Now, there was another trade here, a beautiful one. At the magenta, you see it's always magenta building liquidity, and in this case we had some buying with orange. Break of orange at 20-day moving average. This would have been a beautiful zombie trade here, and grabbing the liquidity down, that was an easy trade. If you were ready and prepared, this could be a very beautiful and easy trade here. Now thereafter you saw magenta building more liquidity, yes, absolutely. But we lacked that selling continuation in that blue. You saw we were just starting to be selling in teal, and that's fine, right? You still could manage your runners, but you have to be very careful. If you do not see clear structure, you cannot take a trade here. And this was when we saw that certain reversal. Now, this is a very interesting concept I want to talk to you about. Now, whenever you see the tapering algorithm here, and you see that magenta still building liquidity, this would make a stronger zombie, because it's not in the strongest selling. And so in my mind, I took a call here, by the way. Now, in my mind, I would be thinking that it will require a stronger head before it starts grabbing liquidity down. So this would make quite a simple zombie trade, and in this case I was lucky because it started selling in that, it started buying in that orange, and I was able to manage my runners quite strongly because of that. And I talked about this closing cup here, right? So if you missed this, I know you may get easily distracted, but so did I, because I overscaled here. It was difficult to manage this trade. I didn't catch the full move, and if I took it at a clearer structure, I may have caught the move better. But that is precisely the problem. Why, if you trade without structure, you will be a headless chicken. It will be quite difficult to manage a trade here. I should have protected here. This would be much easier for me then. But otherwise, wait for cups to close, isn't it? And there's this very advanced trade that I talked about, particularly here, I think. Let's see. This one. Now, this you have to study because it's very important, particularly this one. Right, so you have to understand this yellow, which I identified quite early on here. Once we saw this, I mentioned this. I mentioned about the teal, and you notice we broke the 20-day moving average exactly as it is right there in the strong blue. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful trade. Just take a look. Absolutely beautiful. The point about this is to understand that you are grabbing all the stops and continuing the way down. And why is it going down? You need to know why. Because we were planning for the zombie. And you see how the zombie started forming here to the penny as well, right? On the break of the teal. That's where it grabbed the liquidity of the magenta in that orange. And I mentioned this, we retested the ES 20-day moving average, so you have to be very careful here. So many beautiful trades, and you have to ask yourself, if you were waiting out for structure, how much money can you really make? Because each move this time, it's not just half a point, 1 point. You get 4-point moves. Absolutely beautiful. You have to learn how to be nurturing your runners. And you notice how I tried to hold my 100% trade in this time because there is just no lower low, and I'm always in that orange position. You would see me recharting that orange, trying to find the trajectory of that buying continuation there. So absolutely beautiful at this point. You notice that we identified this pink algorithm here. You see that pink building liquidity here. That's when I was talking about preparing for an inverse head and shoulder. There was an early trade here that you maybe could have taken once you see the wedge. Now, classic wedge pattern, 20-day moving average formed the resistance, and you see we were wedging up in that orange. Most importantly, in a wedge structure, you have to look out for reducing volume. So this is quite clear before we had that candle there. Now, the big problem with this was this very large rebound, and then we started forming more liquidity with the teal. Do you see that here? When you see the teal forming the liquidity, now this is when you need to prepare for that move here to break out of that pink liquidity, instead of looking out for that head and shoulder. Because where's that head and shoulder liquidity here? If the sellers want to be heading down strong, they will. Maybe a rebound here, but you don't see a liquidity from this particular left shoulder pocket here. So if they wanted to go down, they would have went down, right? Or even revert back to a slightly weaker selling precision algorithm. So you realize that there is no selling algorithm. That particular seller has left the building. So in that case, you notice what's next. This is controlled selling. And we were actually forming that inverse head and shoulder pattern in that early trade here. Now at this early trade, it becomes easy because we were looking out for tapering. It was really frustrating. We can't get any entry in, especially if you missed this. And this was exactly when I told you, do not go long here until you see structure forming. And this is exactly why, because we are tapering. And then you notice I added this magenta here. This is crucial, isn't it? Because once you identify this particular magenta algorithm, you know that the bears have an escape plan here. And just take a look, once we had the zombie trade, especially once we didn't have strong continuation. So there are two ways I can tell here. The first way is knowing that there is no bullish control. The bulls are not building liquidity. They're not interested in buying. This is actually controlled buying. So the bears are preparing to taper and preparing to dump this in a way. So you have to be very careful here. And this is where we found that particular move quite straightforward on the break of orange. Now I want you to zoom out now. And remember that the main goal that we want to see the dump and the liquidity is where this was created. So you see this earlier dump here was not liquidity for this, but instead was liquidity for this. So you notice this is important, but the execution here may slightly differ. You see how the market has been constantly building more liquidity around the 20-day moving average. So I caught this trade here. This was a pretty good trade because firstly, once again, beautiful zombie, because I had the pink to guide me and also the magenta to guide me. This magenta was important. Why? Because it formed the previous shoulder. So this formed quite a reliable resistance because it previously was part of the liquidity that went down with the confirmation here. So you see the confirmation was here from the head and shoulder. So this would make a good liquidity for that resistance that I saw here, especially when we built more liquidity around 20-day. And you see the other magenta algorithm here. So this is a beautiful trade. I took it here because of that pink algorithm and the magenta. And thereafter, once we started bouncing up here, you notice that there is a failure at the system here, right? We bounced back below. And so once we rejected this, you have to understand this was still in magenta buying. I always tell you, if it's not in the strongest buying, you don't want it. So once we broke out of that orange and the magenta, you see the early tapering on the break of that pink. when do you enter here? If I was still in this trade, I would have entered right there on the break of orange, on the break of that magenta. And once I see the possibility that this pink may turn back into resistance, I would have totally taken this trade if I were in. So this would have been a beautiful trade on the way down right there. So you see the intricacies of liquidity building and the idea of nested right shoulders. So even we have the right shoulder. This right shoulder is not so, well, I wouldn't say it's not clean, because it certainly is clean. You have to understand nested right shoulders and how buyers have to continue building liquidity. And sometimes you get beautiful moves like that. And all you have to do is to understand how to be looking out for that. Now, once we head it down, especially below the 20-day moving average, it becomes easy. You know, you have magenta, you look for selling continuation, which was what happened. Now, frankly, right here, I would have charted another algorithm. I would have charted maybe something like that and probably took this trade a little later here instead of this break. So when you understand this, you will notice that even when we broke out of this range, we were still tapering. And this gives me more confirmation on the bearish control. And I would have taken this trade too, because I understood that there was stronger bearish control right there. Now, we were still in that pink algorithm here. Now, on second look, I may not have taken the trade. Maybe I would have waited for a structure like that instead. Let me show you. Here and here. So maybe I would have waited for magenta to create more liquidity on the 20-day. This would be marvelous, isn't it? But instead, we broke down from the pink algorithm right here. It's still a possible trade because you identified the teal. So if you were diligently charting, you would have caught this trade here. Now, thereafter, we started bouncing back because you had to protect before the pink. You saw the pink, in this case, selling throughout the day. So you cannot assume it's going to head down. You have the teal and you have the pink. And once it broke teal, you have to cut your runners. It is what it is. And you see that the market was starting to build more liquidity here before it retested 20-day moving average, especially on the breakout of the pink here. So you could have still caught small moves here, but once you started chopping, you have to get hold of your positions. Quite a straightforward day. Now, it's much easier day because it's a large range, right? It's about 4-point range. But you have to be extremely careful because in 4-point ranges like that, you need to have extreme precision. If you do not get a good fill, you will get stopped out very easily, especially if you're trading large contracts. It can be quite stressful. And so this is why you need almost penny perfect algorithms. Continue to chart and continue to be diligent, because you see there are certain algorithms that you get tired of charting, right? Isn't it? Such as this teal. I wouldn't have charted this teal, especially at 1. So you have to be more diligent, and this is really reflects why you have to focus and not overtrade. Find some trades that you can take and call it a day sometimes, and preserve your stamina, and only trade once you're able to chart the algorithms diligently, and only trade when there is structure. Let's talk about Friday. Now, Friday, Powell spoke at 10. And this particular news candle was result of that. We identified the pink algorithm here. Now, there is clear liquidity here as well as the magenta. So this is pretty tricky, as well as it's, well, a news candle. So as I mentioned in the YouTube video, you may want to be careful about worrying about catching this trade. Now, in hindsight, this may look great, even though we identify the pink algorithm. But you are truly subjecting yourself to immense risks if you were partaking into this trade. So some of you did something pretty clever. That is to take a straddle or strangle, expecting that there will be large movements both up and down. And yeah, it paid rewards. Pretty good trade. Now, if you manage to take a strangle or straddle, I would think that's a pretty good strategy. So yeah, well done. But otherwise, so be it, right? We identified this pink, and this was important because even though if you missed this large candle like I did. And I'm not too concerned with this because it's good for your portfolio. As I mentioned, right, things are at a discount. I talked about that on Thursday and Wednesday when Nvidia went back to 170. Right, I talked about getting things on a discount again, and obviously for SPY, for the Qs, and this would have been great for your portfolio. So it's not a big problem. So when the chart goes up, you realize I'm not too concerned. It's always great when the chart goes up. So should you. You should develop that sort of mindset, because at the end of the day, your larger portfolio is very much dependent on the market going up. So at this point, you do see that we broke out here and we identified a few very key points here, particularly that pink algorithm. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that pink algorithm, because you see again that pink algorithm starting to build liquidity here. Now, you have to study through, remember, the Discord server, and if you are able to, the play-by-play of the analysis that I made, because it's time-stamped, you can understand my thought process here. So for example, this particular trade, I mentioned that because of the high volume here, we may not have the room for a clear structure. And so I mentioned that if you see a possible trade whereby you see a breakout and retrace, and in this case, we had a beautiful red candle here, you could still catch a possible trade here for the way up. And yes, I did that. This was a 100% trade for me, just by understanding that the pink was building liquidity. So you see, even though you missed this earlier pink, you are always early for the next trade. And you see again, we had a little retrace. Now this particular trade, not so easy, because this retrace here, you would probably have to take the trade from here. On the breakout, retrace back. On the break here, again, not so easy trade. This is not a trade I would take, right? So this trade I would have taken, and thereafter I would have waited for pink to build more liquidity. And maybe here I would have taken it. But I also warned you by then that there was a lack of buying continuation, right? So we saw how orange was in control. So you have to look out for the orange, and you see the orange breakout again here. So this would have been a viable trade because it broke that pink algorithm, and you had the orange as a base. So this would have been a beautiful stop loss to take your calls, and best if you are able to catch that red candle here and for you to catch this move. But at the same time, we know that there is a magenta, so you would have protected the trade there. So you have caught the perfect move from here to here. Now, is this sufficient for a 100% trade? Maybe with a good fill with that red candle, but otherwise, still plenty of money to be found right here. And you see throughout the entire afternoon, it started tapering in that magenta. This is not ideal, totally not ideal to go long, because you don't see the pink algorithm building liquidity. And that is when we saw a stronger algorithm that I talked about, and that is this yellow, and you see the pink also building liquidity here. This is when you saw the liquidity that's building here, and on the break here, I would have taken a trade, which I did. And that was another 100% trade right there. All because you understood how to be looking out for the algorithms here. Another yellow here that you could have taken a trade here. And understanding this will help you in your trade decisions, because you would definitely wait for that yellow to start building liquidity. And when this pulls down, you do not go short so quickly, because you know that going short, you have to wait for the inverse cup to close. So before the inverse cup closes, you have to see whether the selling is controlled. And in this case, is this selling controlled? Yes, it's controlled, which means it is not a dump. It's controlled, meaning that it is a slow selling. And that means that the bulls are actually building liquidity. And you see exactly that happen. It started breaking out of that pink, and we started pushing out and grabbing liquidity off that yellow. Now, another 100% trade here, but once again, you see we lacked continuation structure. And this was when I knew that we are not going up any higher. If you wanted it to go higher, you have to understand you need a greater algorithm to break out of that magenta in order for this to go higher. And therefore, I told you to be extremely careful about the wedge that's about to form and you see the wedge. If I drew it from the bottom instead of this, it would have been a perfect wedge, as I talked about near end of day. Because once we lack continuation here, even the yellow building liquidity cannot bring this higher up. It means that they're controlling the selling and the buying, as well as it's not going to dump. You trap so many shorts here, they're just going to leave it to die. And there it is. There you have it, why I talked about the wedge here at the end. So you have to understand all these context, and most importantly, understand that the pink algorithm comes in useful even after this large green candle. So be honest with yourself. When you see this large green candle, what is your response? And I want you to be honest with yourself. If you started to complain, if you started to whine, if you started to lose focus, or you started to chase, worse off, or you started to just call the reversal mindlessly, then you have to recalibrate and reconsider this weekend and recenter yourself. Because as I've shown you, just take a look. I've got the secret right here with the pink algorithm, and you just had to reuse it, and you would be able to find profits in the charts. And that will remind you what your true objective is. Is your objective to find profits in the charts, or is it to catch the big move? So more than just technical aspect of this trading, you have to also be able to explore your psychological aspect and your mentality behind this. And that's the only way to improve.